problem right now. Now, over the past couple weeks, you have seen this way more than I have. Out of nowhere, it seems like everybody has gone from loving RWB and what it stands for to absolutely hating on it pretty much everywhere you go. And it started with this video.
No! God, please, no!
Now, we've had the joy of going pretty much all across the country together, all across the world together, and we've been able to make a ton of friends and meet a lot of really cool shops along the way. And so when I started to see people start to talk kind of terribly about RWB, I wanted to figure out just why. And this is my opinion as to why I think that is, because I think it goes further than just people, well, cutting up Porsches. So let's talk about it. Now, we're seeing videos pop up all over the place. We're talking about chicken wire and silicone glue and cutting up cars and all this sort of stuff that seems to make every single clickbait video on YouTube go viral. And so I need to take it just a little bit of a step back. I'm gonna spend a little bit of time on the history of RWB because you may not know where it actually started. Now, Akira Nakai is a name that most people would know when we start talking about RWB. The whole story is really simple. It's 60 seconds or less. This whole thing came into concept when Akira was relatively young. We're talking about middle 20s or so, and he was working at a shop where essentially he came across a beaten, bruised, and absolutely destroyed Porsche 911. He bought it, he wanted to make it his own. He was a car enthusiast before that. He had been drifting under a different team name, and he was having a lot of fun, and he thought that he could make something happen with this Porsche. He's always been a Porsche fan, he always was a Porsche fan, and there was nothing really stopping him from trying to take this kind of clunky piece of crap and turning it into something special. And the biggest thing that he did was he cut up the fenders and he made the car ultra wide, essentially establishing what one might call is this Japanese style on an otherwise European car. But here's the key thing that a lot of people have a tendency to miss. This car was kind of a piece of junk when he bought it and he went to fix it. Now, Akira and the whole concept of the car was that he would go out and he would drive these cars. He spent a ton of time behind the wheel of this car, making it super light, very fast, and a ton of fun. And over time, more people wanted that too. That's the whole story in 60 seconds. Now, in the early 2000s, ultimately RWB would come over to the United States, and there were 2 RWB cars built for 2 people that were relatively, I would argue, famous in the aftermarket automotive scene. Once news got kind of around that those 2 cars got built and people got to see what an RWB kit looked like on a Porsche, pretty much turned into everyone wanting one. Now, here's something I just want to set the record straight on. People have this weird infatuation with talking about how poorly designed these cars are, how poorly these cars are put together as. So I went and I looked at like 20 different RWB builds just here at Sema, and probably another dozen or so that I've met along the way as we've been traveling around the world. And I gotta say, there was not a single time where I saw something where I thought to myself, somebody was necessarily cutting corners. Here's the thing. The whole concept, the shroud around this Akira Nakai thing is that he's some sort of mysterious man. He shows up with nothing. He gets charioted in on this gorgeous chair and he smokes 27 packs of cigarettes a day and drinks a 30-pack of Coca-Cola, and he stares ominously at a car that he's about to rip in half. And that is what TikTok would have you believe he does. That's not, unfortunately, what he does. Akira Nakai is a car enthusiast, and he's gone through this process of finding a place for him and his style in a culture of groups of people that love to also modify their cars. But Akira's not necessarily coming in and demanding Coca-Cola or demanding cigarettes. He's coming in, and a lot of times, all that he asks for is that the car is prepped and ready to go based on what the color car is gonna be, what they might wanna do with the car in terms of wheels, tires, and suspension. Outside of that, there's a collaborative conversation that happens between him and the person who's going to end up building that car. Now, he's responsible for making sure that this kit looks as good as it does. But the problem with this is that Akira's not necessarily building the whole car. Akira is only building a portion of the car. And so what happens is sometimes catch glimpses of what would otherwise be an OEM Porsche with ultra wide wheels, huge fenders, a massive suspension drop, and people will critique it for being a stock 3.6. But that's not Akira's job. Akira comes in and he puts the body kit on. Now, with it being $50,000, you might expect that something like this should be really expensive. After all, everybody on the internet is now dogging on this thing. I don't understand it, I don't really know why, and it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But I do think I kind of figured it out after I talked to people who owned these cars, and after I spent a little bit of time figuring out why do so many people seem to hate RWB right now.
I think generally I can see where people would say he's destroying a car, but what's the point of making something your own and marketing it to people that want something different than destroying it and making it different and unique?
Once you experience it and you see it and you've been around it up close, which a lot of people don't get that opportunity, for me, it's really cool, and it's really broadens my perspective on exactly the kind of work that he does and just how unique he really is.
I gotta say that if you are a lack of friends, get yourself an RWB, because you'll be the most popular guy at the car show. And aside from that, the attention you get, the community of RWB owners really, when you start to get to know them, you get to see the personality that comes through in each one of the cars over time, not even just when the build is done. Just as everybody adds extra elements, it starts to come into a personality display. And that's one of the best things ever. Is I got into it for the cars, but my true love now is with the family around RWB and the people I met along that process. The whole thing about Porsche is obviously personalization, right? Porsche is a big deal about spending a lot of money on PTS colors, on customizing your car. And this is the next natural progression of doing air-cooled cars and even 997s. It really brings everything together. And now I see clients that may have never ever considered RWB see me pull up next to my GT3 and next to everything else, and I say, wow, these worlds can live together. And not only do they live together, they're harmonious. Yeah. You start working them and looking at it that way.
As we've had a chance to go from America to Mexico to Europe to Japan, we've gotten to experience what different cultures do with cars. And this is going to seem a little bit far-fetched, so you can put the tin hat on if you don't believe me, but here's what I think is what's happening. In the Japanese car culture, what I've noticed is that there's a general tendency that a vehicle is going to be something that a lot of people are going to put their heart and soul into. More often than not, the more extreme you go with a car, the more extreme you go with the modifications, the more of a counterculture type of person you have a tendency to be. You don't have to look far when you even go over to the stories of Rocket Bunny and Pandem, where Miura-san had an element of being involved in the Bosuzoku. This was something that we learned when we got to meet his team. And so when he went to go develop his own things, they were wide and boisterous and loud and crazy, because there's not a whole lot else out there in terms of the Japanese culture where you get to do that level of individualism. So to express yourself through a race car is a pretty damn good way of doing it. And that is one bucket, in my opinion. That's what you're seeing with the wide arches and the crazy wing and the excessive wheels that are just massive, right? It's this huge expression while still being something that looks really good. Now, let's take it to the second bucket. And this is why I say you need to keep your tin hats on, because I might not be making any sense. You have now the European car culture. These are the Italians and the Germans that have spent so much time around building or buying or collecting cars that would otherwise be considered a really expensive piece of machinery. When I was a kid, I dreamed of having a 993. That was like my dream. It still is one of my dream cars. And Porsches and Ferraris have always been one of those cars that I've always wanted to own. And I think you do too. And so when you take something that's as sacrilegious as a really nice spec'd Porsche and you cut it into a billion pieces, it's not gonna take you very long for people to question just what in the hell are you doing? Now here's the thing that I'll say with that. I've watched people critique RWB for doing these sort of things, but at the end of the day, it's a car. But we're gonna get into that. Finally, you have this third culture. The third culture is the culture that really exploded in the early 2000s, and that is the American culture in the car scene, really latching on to what RWB established in Japan. Americans, you don't have to go very far to understand what we're all about. It's a very simple formula. Number one, you need to be yourself. You need to be individualistic. You need to be expressive and unique, and everything about you is determined by how different you are, and you're proud of that. And the whole American culture style is very individualistic. So you kind of have this opportunity where you're seeing these worlds start to collide. You have this Japanese culture and heritage around car building and style, which is where you get the RWB. Then you have these groups of people that are looking at this happening to these Porsches and even Italian cars, for instance, and different brands, that are cutting these cars up, which seems so counter to what you would ever do with a car like this. And then finally, you have the Americans that, or I would just argue the folks that just want to be as individualistic as you possibly can. And they don't want to do anything besides stand out, be different, and be better than everyone else. They want to be the tip of the iceberg. Except through all of this, and while I say all these three groups, I don't think you could ever really put them in a single room and not end up with one person getting their ass beat. For some reason or another, two of those three groups can always work really well, but the moment you introduce the third group, I think is when things start to get really weird. And that's what I think has started to happen with RWB. You have these different cultures that have had a tendency to stay relatively further apart, but now that it's gotten so popular and so big, now they're all just in one pool, and everybody's deciding what you should or shouldn't do with a Porsche. Should you cut it up or should you not cut it up? And to that I have to say, after talking to anybody, who cares? When you look at building and modifying cars, it's all about expressionism. It's all about art. It's all about doing things that you want to do. Whether the car is $5,000 or $500,000, it doesn't really depend on that. The key thing that I think has changed in this space is that what happened at the beginning of RWB in terms of putting these kits on cars was that they were kind of already put on cars that were already at the end of their life. After all, the tagline that was on RWB for a while and is on certain cars roughly translates from German to English as second life, giving it a second set of, opportunities out there. And that's exactly what RWB kits were. Look at some of the early examples of this, and those cars weren't necessarily the best to look at, and they are a little rough. But as it's gotten more popular, people have become more willing to give Nakai cleaner and cleaner and cleaner Porsches. But Nakai's process and how he builds it and how he cuts and how he processes the car has not changed at all. And what you have is this imbalance of what people are expecting for how much they're spending compared to what Nakai has started to do and what RWB as a team, as a whole, not just himself, have done. And you've got this weird space now where everybody seems to think that because he's using certain types of material or because he's using silicone gasket or because he's doing this or this, that for some reason that makes his process or his art less valuable than what it should. I'm gonna break some terrible news for you here. Ever since we started Martini Works, ever since we started helping people figure out what car parts they wanted to buy, there's always a few people that will say, well, is it worth it? Nothing in terms of modifying a car is going to be financially worth it. You do it because you love to do it. You do it because there's memories that come along the way. You do it because it's fun. And this is another example of that, just on a much larger scale. The money is bigger, the pockets are deeper, the cars are crazier, but at the end of the day, people are just doing it because they want to express themselves. But there's a lot of myths around an RWB build that are just simply wrong. The concept of needing to show up and supply him with an existential amount of Coca-Cola just isn't true. The concept of him telling you what he is going to do to your car and what you're not allowed to do to your car just isn't true. He's a human being. He shows up, he talks to you, he wants to know what you want to do with your build, and then he gets to work. And he's done it for so long that he doesn't want to use other tools. Does that mean that the build quality could be better? Sure. But is the build quality that bad to begin with? No. We've looked at over a dozen of these cars. We've looked at the tow hooks, and I can tell you without a shadow of the doubt, the quality that we see here on the outside and inside the fenders is pretty darn good. One of the things that blew my mind was when I was actually watching one of the RWB kits happen outside of Sema 2024, I watched him work on the car. And there was this constant back and forth of what seemed to be him looking, evaluating, and then working with his team to figure it out. And then I realized he lost where his goddamn tools were. And then he couldn't figure out where he put something and set it down. Then he'd look at something, he'd go to the other side. He'd come to the back side, he'd look at the other side. And I realized through everything else, he's just a car person. He just loves cars. And the concept of this getting blown to now cloud nine in terms of this being one of the most perfect example builds that you can possibly do, or one of the worst things you can possibly do to a Porsche, I think is just a little bit of baloney. And the reason there seems to be more and more criticism and controversy around this car and what's happening is because these cultures of the European car culture, the Japanese car culture, and the American car culture are now starting to blend into this space, and they all have an opinion on what this should or shouldn't be. And the great news, and I hate to tell you this, is it doesn't really matter. There are a group of people that love what he's done with this car, and there's a group of people that will always hate what people have done with their car. And I know that you're gonna tell me in the comments below on whether you think this is a good thing or a bad thing, but I'm gonna be honest, 25 years ago, you could buy a 993, you could buy a 964 for the same price as a BRZ or an FRS, because people didn't think they were fantastic cars to begin with. Just one day, people decided that Porsches were collector cars, and they went from $20,000 to $150,000. And the same exact thing is happening with Nissans and Toyotas and Japanese cars in general. Things are only worth what people think things are worth. And for me, in terms of having a car that's as unique as this and as different as this, in terms on if it should be something that's accepted or criticized to stop doing, I'm always gonna be a fan of saying, I think this world and this culture needs more of this. But I'm sure you're gonna let me know if you think I am absolutely ass backwards on this. And if so, let me know below. And I appreciate it so much. Let me know your thoughts on RWB. And thank you, Sema, so much for letting me walk around and check out a dozen or so of these RWB cars to be able to meet these incredible folks like Joe who have built this car, drive it absolutely everywhere in the New York City, Jersey area. It allowed me to look underneath the car, allowed me to pull on the tow hook so I could see if it was legit or not legit. That is an awesome experience. And I'm so freaking stoked that I get to share this story with you, but I know it's not everyone's cup of tea. So let me know below. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.